He said it the way you'd say something obvious. Like he was correcting me for believing the sky was green. Mom, you don't actually have savings, not real savings. I was standing at the kitchen counter in my own home. Well, it had been my home for 31 years, and I had just poured him a cup of tea. Earl Grey, the kind he liked as a boy. He was sitting at the table with his elbows on the wood. I'd refinished myself the summer his father passed, and he said it like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I didn't answer right away. I set the kettle down. I looked out the window at the backyard where the birch trees had gone gold, the way they do every October in Sudbury. The light was doing that thin afternoon thing, pale and honest, and I actually thought, maybe I'd heard him wrong. I hadn't. My son-in-law was the one who'd planted it. I know that now. I didn't know it then, not completely, but I felt the shape of it the way you feel weather changing before the clouds move in. My daughter had married him 4 years ago, and for the first 2 years, everything seemed fine. He was attentive, brought flowers, called me by my first name in a way that felt warm rather than disrespectful. Then my husband died. His name was Bill. 43 years we were married, and he went quietly, the way he'd always done everything. Without fuss, without fanfare, in the hospital bed with his hand in mine, and the hockey game on low in the background because he'd asked for it. The nurses were kind. My daughter drove up from Barrie, my son flew in from Calgary, and then the house got very quiet, and I was 68 years old and alone for the first time in my adult life. I managed. People always underestimate what managing looks like from the inside. It's not graceful. It's not the grief you see in movies. It's standing in the cereal aisle for 11 minutes because Bill always picked the brand, and now there's no one to tell you which one. It's learning how to use the snowblower he always did himself. It's calling the furnace company when something rattles and realizing you don't know what questions to ask. But I managed. Bill had been careful with money his entire life. He grew up in Thunder Bay, the oldest of 5, and he never forgot what it felt like to want things you couldn't have. We paid off the mortgage in 2009. We maxed our RRSPs every year for 2 decades. He had a defined benefit pension from 30 years at the mill, and it continued, reduced, but continued after his death. I had my own small pension from the school board, 22 years as an educational assistant. And there was the life insurance. Not a fortune, but enough. More than enough, actually. I knew the number. I'd sat with our financial advisor at TD after Bill passed and gone through every account, every statement, every beneficiary designation. I knew exactly what I had and what I didn't. I was not confused. I was not naive. I was a 68-year-old woman who had helped manage a household budget since 1981, and I knew precisely where I stood. My son-in-law did not know that I knew. The conversation started slowly. First, it was just my daughter asking, gently, whether I'd thought about the future, whether the house was getting to be a lot to manage on my own, whether it might make sense to think about options. I told her I was fine. She nodded and let it go. Then her husband started joining those conversations. He's a planner. He works in finance, actually, or adjacent to it, something with commercial real estate, and he has a way of talking that sounds very reasonable, very organized. He uses phrases like long-term sustainability and liquidity concerns. And he says them with such confidence that you feel foolish for not having thought of them yourself. The first time he laid out his concerns about my financial situation, I actually thanked him for caring. I'm embarrassed about that now. Over the following year, the story changed, subtly. The way a photograph fades, you don't notice any single day, but then one day you look and the colors are wrong. In this new version of the story, I was someone who had barely scraped by. Bill had been the financial brain. I didn't understand investments. The pension wasn't as much as I thought. The house needed work that would eat into whatever reserves I had. By the time I was 70 in this version, I'd be relying on them. My daughter started to believe it. That's the part that hurt most. She called one Thursday evening in February, and her voice had that careful quality, the one she uses when she's rehearsed what she's going to say. She told me they'd been thinking that they'd love to have me closer, that their house in Barrie had the basement suite that had been sitting empty since they renovated it, that it made sense financially for me to sell the Sudbury house and move in with them, and that I could contribute to the household. Whatever you're comfortable with, Mom. No pressure to help with the mortgage, since interest rates had made everything so difficult. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said I'd think about it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in Bill's side of the bed, which I still do sometimes, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about my daughter's voice, how she sounded like she was reading from notes, how she said we instead of I every single time. I thought about the basement suite in Barrie. I'd seen it at Thanksgiving. It was clean and bright enough, but there was one window that looked at a fence, and the bathroom had no bathtub, only a walk-in shower. And I thought about my body at 80, navigating that shower in a house where I had no authority, where I was a contributor, whatever you're comfortable with, in someone else's home. I called my friend Gwen the next morning. Gwen had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired, and she is the least sentimental person I know, which is exactly why I love her. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I hadn't. She gave me a name, a woman in Sudbury who specialized in estate planning and elder law. I made an appointment for the following week, and I didn't tell anyone. The meeting lasted 2 hours. We went through everything, every account, the house, the pension, the insurance payout, the small non-registered account I'd been quietly adding to for years without ever mentioning it to anyone. The lawyer, whose name was Patricia, asked me careful questions and wrote things down in a neat hand. And at the end she said, "You're in a very strong position. You don't need anyone's help." She also told me some other things about what it can look like when adult children or their spouses begin managing an older parent's finances without proper authority, about how it often starts exactly the way mine had started, and about what steps I could take, quietly, to make sure my affairs were airtight. I took all of them. I updated my will. I established a trust with my 2 grandchildren, my son's kids in Calgary, as beneficiaries. I made sure every account, every investment, every beneficiary designation was exactly where I wanted it. I put the house, my house, the one with the birch trees in the backyard and 31 years of life in the walls, into a formal estate plan so that no one could pressure me into selling it under anything less than my own free will. And I said nothing to anyone. March came and my daughter called again. Her husband's voice was in the background. I could hear it, not words, just the cadence of it, the rhythm of a man who is directing something. She asked if I thought more about Barrie. I said I was still thinking. She said they didn't want to rush me, but the basement suite was just sitting there, and it seemed like such a waste. And wouldn't it be nice to be near the grandkids? I said yes, it would be nice to be near the grandkids. I drove to Barrie in April for Easter. My son and his family flew in from Calgary, which was a surprise, a good one. We had ham and scalloped potatoes, and the kids hid eggs in the backyard until one of them stepped on the dog and cried for 20 minutes. It was loud and warm, and I sat at the table and watched my family, and I felt, underneath all of it, a very quiet sadness that I was working hard not to show. After dinner, while the kids were watching a movie, my son-in-law came and sat beside me with his wine glass and his reasonable voice. He said they'd been thinking about the practicalities of the move, that it would probably make the most sense, given my limited income, for me to sell the Sudbury house and put the proceeds toward their mortgage. A co-ownership arrangement, he called it. He'd had a colleague look at the numbers. Limited income. I set down my tea. I looked at my daughter across the table. She was watching me with something complicated in her face. Not quite hope, not quite guilt. Something in between. I looked at my son-in-law with his wine and his colleague and his numbers. And I said very quietly, "How much do you think I have exactly?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that means the other person thinks they already know the answer. "Well, with the pension and whatever Bill left, Probably enough to be comfortable for a few years, but realistically. I see, I said. And that was all I said? That night, lying in their guest room, I thought about the word realistically, the confidence of it, the ease with which he'd assembled a version of my finances in his head, wrong in nearly every particular, and presented it to me as fact, the way my daughter had nodded along. I thought about Bill, about the way he used to say, "Never let anyone make your decisions for you, Marlene, not even me." He'd said it as a joke, mostly, but he meant it. He always meant the things he said as jokes. My name is Marlene. I was 69 years old that Easter, and I was not confused, and I was not afraid, and I was not running out of money. I drove home to Sudbury the next morning. The birch trees were still bare, but the snow had pulled back from the south side of the yard, and the light was that particular April light that makes everything look like it's just about to begin. I stood on the back porch with my coffee, and I thought, no. Not no to my daughter, not no out of anger. Just no, not this, not on these terms. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from my financial advisor at TD. There was a flag on my account. Someone had called inquiring about my account balances, not requesting access, just inquiring, and the bank had declined to give any information per standard privacy protocol, but they wanted to let me know. I knew the number that had called. I didn't need to ask. I called Patricia, the lawyer. She said what had happened wasn't illegal, just a phone call, but she said something that I've thought about every day since. The fact that someone feels entitled to that information tells you something important about their intentions. I thanked her. I hung up. Then I called my son in Calgary. His name is Andrew, and he has his father's voice, the low, unhurried kind that makes you feel like there's time for everything. I told him all of it. Not to complain, not to make him angry at his sister, just because I needed someone in the family to know, and I needed it to be him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you want me to come out?" I told him I didn't need him to come out. I just needed him to know. He said, "Okay, Mom, I've got you." That was enough. I called my daughter the following Sunday. I told her I had made a decision about Barry. I wasn't coming. Not now. Not in the current arrangement. I told her I loved her, and I loved the grandkids, and I wanted to be part of their lives. But I was staying in my house, and my finances were in excellent order, and I did not need a co-ownership arrangement or a basement suite or a colleague's analysis of my numbers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did Andrew say something?" I said, "This is my decision, sweetheart. I made it." There was another silence, longer. She said, "Mom, we were just trying to help." I said, "I know." And I meant it. I think she was, partly. I think she had let herself be convinced that helping me meant absorbing me. I think she believed the version her husband had built. But believing a wrong thing doesn't make it right. We didn't talk for 6 weeks. That was the hardest part. Not the legal steps. Not the financial planning. Not even the phone call from the bank. It was the silence from my daughter. The way her name didn't appear on my phone for 6 whole weeks, and the way I kept the ringer on just in case. She called in June, on a Tuesday afternoon out of nowhere while I was weeding the flower bed along the back fence. I had dirt on my hands when I answered. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I waited. She said, "I think I let him do too much of the talking. I think I stopped listening to you and started listening to him, and I knew what you were like. I grew up watching you and Dad, and I should have known better." I sat down on the garden step. My knees aren't what they were. I said, "Tell me about the kids." And she did. She talked for 40 minutes about the kids and the end of the school year and the swim lessons and the tooth that her youngest had finally lost. And I sat there in the dirt with the phone against my ear and let my daughter's voice fill up the yard. Things are different now, not all better, different. She comes to Sudbury more than she used to, and she doesn't always bring her husband, and when she does, He is careful around me in a way that is not warmth, but is at least respect. I've decided that's enough for now. My house is exactly as it's always been. The birch trees went gold again this October. I had Patricia update a few things in the estate plan, small adjustments, everything tidy. Andrew calls on Sundays. I went out to Calgary in September to see the grandkids, and the youngest one, she's 6, climbed into my lap at bedtime and asked me to tell her a story, and I did. I made one up on the spot about a woman who lived in a house with birch trees and who had, in the quiet and without any fuss, kept everything she'd earned. The little one said, "Was she brave?" I thought about it. I said she was something better than brave. She was sure. I keep thinking about that Easter dinner, the ham going cold on the table, my grandkids running around the backyard, and my son-in-law sitting beside me with his wine glass explaining what my own finances looked like. Calmly, confidently, completely wrong. What strikes me now isn't the anger. I moved through that a long time ago. It's how ordinary it all looked from the outside. A family eating together. A son-in-law who seemed concerned. A daughter who thought she was helping. The machinery of it was so quiet. That's what I want other women to understand, especially women my age. The danger doesn't always have a sharp edge. Sometimes it arrives in a reasonable voice, with a spreadsheet, and calls itself love. I don't think my daughter is a bad person. I never did. But she made a choice, for a long stretch of time, to let someone else do her thinking for her when it came to me. And that choice had a cost. Not just to me, but to us, to the relationship we'd built over 69 years of her being my daughter and me being her mother. Things like that don't heal all the way. They heal enough, and then you learn to be careful around the scar. What protected me wasn't luck. It was that I had done the unglamorous, undramatic work of understanding my own life. The RRSPs, the estate plan, the hour I spent sitting with Patricia going through every account, none of it was exciting. Bill used to joke that I kept better records than Revenue Canada. But that attention, that refusal to be vague about my own circumstances, was the thing that kept me standing when someone tried to convince me I was falling. I think about the women who don't have a Gwen to call, who don't have an Andrew on the other end of the phone saying, "I've got you," who believe the version of themselves that someone else has assembled because no one in their life is reflecting back a truer one. That's the thing that keeps me up some nights more than anything that happened to me directly. What I know now, and what I knew then, even when I was lying awake staring at the ceiling, is that clarity is its own form of courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, just the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept someone else's accounting of your worth. Knowing what you have, knowing what you've earned, knowing that a 69-year-old woman standing in her own kitchen, in her own house, with 31 years of life in the walls, does not need to be managed. My granddaughter asked me if the woman in the story was brave. I told her she was something better, she was sure. I meant it then. I mean it more now. Because bravery still has fear in it. Sureness is what's left when you've done the work, made the calls, signed the papers, and sat with your own life long enough to know exactly what it's worth. That's what I hope she carries with her. That's what I hope you carry too.